With today's lecture, we're going to be exploring ancient architecture. And ancient architecture, whether it's the pyramids at Giza or the temples on top of the Acropolis, they're all really created with the same construction technique, which is the shell system. With the shell system, this means that there's one basic building material that provides the structural support as well as the outer covering of the building. Now, this is all going to switch up in our next lecture on modern architecture because that deals with the skeleton and skin system. We build modern buildings, post-1851 buildings, in a completely different way than we're going to see the buildings that were built during this lecture. So we'll start back with prehistoric architecture. And just like painting and sculpture, chapters we've already covered, architecture also finds its genesis during the Stone Age. And here we have two specific areas, the Paleolithic era and the Neolithic era. So Paleolithic era is during the time of such as the cave paintings, for instance. The structures here are much more temporary. And we're going to look at some mammoth bone houses. So let's look at that right away. The mammoth bone house is basically the size of a really large tent. It's about 15 feet in diameter, and you can kind of see how the tusks of the woolly mammoth make really good arch supports for the entryway. These structures also would have been covered once they were built with animal hide for insulation, which you kind of see here, and that's not my daughter there. But you can see relatively the size of this structure. Again, it's about the size of a large tent. When we move from the Paleolithic era to the Neolithic era, and this is when the Ice Age ends, the world becomes more habitable, we start to live in smaller communities, domesticate animals and crops, here's where we start to see more permanent architecture. This is the settlement at SKARA, which is off the coast of Scotland in what are called the Orkney Islands. We have 7 basic structures here within this community, and we're going to look at the one kind of in the upper right-hand corner. That's really the best preserved. Size-wise, this is about 20 feet square, or about the size of a 2-car garage. And we have a couple different building techniques that are brought to us here. When we look at the edges of this structure, it's made with like a flat stone. But each time the stone new layer is put on, it's pushed slightly inward. So this home would have been covered, again, very much like a tent in terms of shape. And this is called corbelling. Corbelling is a very crude form of an arch. As we saw in the previous image, each layer of the stone is going to be set slightly inward from the one below. The weight of the roof is transmitted down the walls to the ground. So basically what you're doing is creating a fairly large uninterrupted space, usually around 20 feet in diameter. The largest corbelled structure in the world is about 45 feet in diameter. And that is the Treasury of ATREUS. This is an above-ground tomb created during the Mycenaean age on the Greece mainland. And here's a little bit better of an idea of what corbelling truly looks like. And this is very much a finished stone. We don't see any jagged edges protruding out from the wall. This has been finished. Unfortunately, though, these were very easy to loot, and not one of these tombs have ever been found with anything inside of it. Also here at the settlement at SKARA, when we look at the back wall, we have kind of like a bookcase looking element, a cabinet in a way, and that's created with what's called the post and lintel system. The post and lintel system is something we're going to see throughout ancient architecture, but it's also going to be something that we kind of remember as building as kids. It's a very fundamental idea that the posts are upright and they support a crossbeam called the lintel. Now, post and lintel construction can find its genesis back at Stonehenge, and this is one of our earliest megalithic structures. I will show you a few pictures of it, of how it looks now, and of course, this is how we thought it looked back when it was complete. But Stonehenge is unique also because it's a site that keeps being built upon again and again. It was constructed over roughly 1,000-year period, from 2500 BC to 1600 BC. And the term megalith just basically means large stone. There's all sorts of different theories as to why it was built. It definitely matches up with astronomical points in the sky, so we say that it could have been an astronomical observatory. It served as a solar calendar. This was a place where religious rituals took place, a place for healing the sick, and also ashes have been found on the site. So at one time it was used as a crematorium. To me, the most exciting thing is not even about the stones and where they're placed, but the fact is that this culture back in 2500 BC had to be structured in a way that they could quarry, transport, and raise these stones. The average stone is 26 tons, and some weigh twice that amount. Some of these stones are as tall as 16 feet, and they had to be moved through marshland and forest over 23 miles from the quarry to this specific site. And I also want to talk a little bit about dolmens, because this is another form of megalithic architecture, and these were tombs. Dolmens are frequently found in Ireland, but also in other areas around the world, primarily throughout England and Northern Europe. So several upright stones are placed close together, and then there's a lintel, or capstone in this case, that is even larger than all of the other stones, and these would have been then mounded over to form an artificial hill or a cairn. So the most famous is the Brown Hills dolmen, and just that capstone alone on top is like over 300 tons. And again, these would have been looking very natural in the landscape, as they would have had dirt over them and sod on top of that, so they would have looked like a natural outcropping or a hill. Also with the post and lintel, we have the famous Lion's Gate, which is in MYCENAE. Again, it's on the Greek mainland where we found those Tholos tombs, that treasury of ATREUS in the earlier image when we talked about corbelling. And this is part of the fortification wall of the citadel at MYCENAE. And this is the citadel here. This was a culture that was very aggressive, very warlike. And you can see the fortification wall, particularly at the bottom of the screen. You'll also see kind of a circle. That's called Grave Circle A. And just to the left of that, where the fortification wall kind of gets thin, and then there's another perpendicular wall to that, that's where the famous Lion's Gate is. The lions themselves are about 9.5 feet high. Their faces, unfortunately, were made out of some type of precious metal, either bronze or gold, and they were stolen and melted down centuries ago. As you enter the Lion's Gate, off to the right, that was where that grave circle was. And this is at the same time where those above ground tombs were also created. The above ground tombs, they were all looted, but these, what are called shaft graves, provide us with a lot of material from this ancient culture. This is where we have not only pottery and remains of individuals, but we also have really rare works made out of gold, such as this funerary mask, and sometimes it's called the Mask of Agamemnon, but it's, not really Agamemnon. A whole bunch of these masks have been found, along with other materials such as daggers and such. We also see the post and lintel construction here in the Greek temples, the columns serving as the posts, and then what's called the architrave above, that's going to be the lintel. And we do need to know the three orders of Greek architecture. At the left, we have the Doric, in the middle, the Ionic, and at the right, we have the Corinthian style. These are very easy to identify by looking at the ornamentation at the top of the column. And we'll start with the Doric order first. This is the very first order of Greek architecture, originating around 600 BC, and it's considered to be very masculine. It's a little bit thicker column. It tends to be shorter than all of the rest, so it's a little bit stocky, but it's also very plain. There's no ornamentation around the top. It just kind of moves right toward the architrave there. And this is where the oldest buildings on the Acropolis would have been made from. And the most stunning temple is, of course, the Parthenon. That was the very first structure built, and in this image it's above to the right. It was dedicated to the goddess Athena, and when you walked inside of this temple, you would have had a floor-to-ceiling sculpture of Athena by the famed artist Phidias. And that's what it would have looked like. A few human figures down at the bottom right to give you an idea of the size of this sculpture. And you can see a recreation today in Nashville, Tennessee, of all places. And the Parthenon is going through major restoration. It is supposed to take close to 100 years, and they are reconstructing it to how it originally looked. There is a lot of argument whether we should leave it in its current state or conserve it to its original position, but that's what they're planning on doing right now. You can see kind of the scaffolding around the structure. There are some pretty good videos on its reconstruction, and if I can find them, I'll put them in the link in the descriptions. But one of the issues that I have with it is that when we're recreating this structure and we don't have the marble, they're making brand new computer-generated pieces to fill in the spaces. However, new marble does not look like old marble. So for instance, off here, we've got this drum, which is what columns are made from. It looks completely different. And especially on the back wall here, on the inside of the temple, you can see that it's done perfectly, but a lot of it is done with new marble. So we're going to move on from the Doric order to the Ionic order. And the Ionic order dates back to around 440 BC. It is considered to be feminine. These columns are tall, they're very thin, they're graceful, and they are usually what's going to adorn the temples of the goddesses. The style is imported. It's called Ionic because it comes from the Ionia region, which is present-day Turkey. And it is identified by the two scrolls on either side, and these are officially called volutes. And the temple of Athena Nike would be one of the temples to the goddesses where we would see the Ionic order. But the most famous is the Corinthian. Everyone loves the Corinthian order because it is the most ornate. And usually it's acanthus leaves like you see in this figure, but a lot of times too it can be different types of ornamentation such as rosettes. So the story of it goes that a little girl passed away and her possessions were put into a basket that was then placed on her grave. And from underneath the basket and surrounding the basket is where this acanthus plant grew. And that's the scene that you see on top of the Corinthian column. Now, the Greeks prized this order and only had these columns in the most sacred parts of the temple, which would have been the interior rooms. However, when the Roman civilization conquers the Greeks, the Romans put this everywhere, particularly around the colonnade. So when we look at a structure like this, and this is the remains of the Temple of Zeus, we can see that we have the Corinthian style along the colonnade, which is the outermost ring of columns. This is something that we can absolutely identify as being from the Roman Empire rather than the Greek Empire. Even though this is in present-day Greece, we can see the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis to the left, but still this temple right in front of us is Roman in origin. A couple other things you need to know about columns. First of all, they are tapered, and this is through what's called entasis. And we've talked a lot in this class about how our eyes don't work correctly. The idea of linear perspective is built from the fact that our eyes try to pull parallel lines together to a point in the distance called a vanishing point. And what entasis does is by tapering these columns, when we look at them from a distance, they will appear straight, perpendicular to us. Compared to if we had done these truly, perpendicular to the ground, they would have looked crooked. And even when you go to like the Parthenon today, you'll notice that the entire work is a little bit concave. The floor itself kind of rises more toward the center than on the edges. And this is to correct our viewing this temple from various distances. The columns are also made up of several pieces called drums. So they are not one solid work. However, we will see some solid columns. Most of those are imported during the Roman Empire. Speaking of the Romans are who give us the arch. That's who invents it. And when the arch is created, it completely revolutionizes architecture. All of a sudden, structures can have larger spans compared to both post and lintel and corbelling types of construction. So we had talked about corbelling, like the largest corbelled structure is roughly 40 feet in diameter. Well, with an arch, we can create 60 feet, 80 feet, even 140-foot spans. Arches are created through wedge-shaped stones called voussoirs, and the last wedge-shaped stone to go into place is called the keystone. And you can kind of see how the pressure is transmitted off to the sides here. The very first time arches were used in a major building project was for the Pont du Gard. This covers or spans the Gard River in France, and during this time France was part of the Roman Empire. It is a remarkable structure. It is roughly 180 foot tall, and it's about 800 feet in terms of width. It is not only a bridge, which is the main secondary level there, right above the water, but the very top level is an aqueduct, and it takes water basically 20 miles to the city of Nîmes. It was built in only 5 years, and only the top portion of it had any mortar, and that was, of course, to hold the water. It's important because this is all about man's control over nature. Early civilizations, we had to live near a water source. Whether it was in Egypt, all those cities grew up around the Nile, or the Middle East, the cities grew up around the Tigris and Euphrates. Now, all of a sudden, we can transport water from its source to where the people need it. And it is an absolutely beautiful structure to look at. Also in the Roman Empire, this is the Pantheon. And I'm going to include a video in the description below that you should watch. It is created by Smart History, and they will walk you through all the different elements of the Pantheon much better than I could. You will notice that we do have Corinthian columns around the colonnade, and that does denote this as a Roman structure. In fact, it is the best preserved of all of the ancient Roman monuments. It has served a variety of purposes over the centuries, originally as a temple to the gods, then as a church, and now it has been converted into a tourist attraction. So a lot of the problems that we have with these ancient Roman monuments is that the street level over the centuries has risen. So in ancient Roman times, you would walk up to the Pantheon like a regular Roman or Greek temple. You would walk up a set of steps into the entrance, but today all those steps have been buried and you actually descend now into the Pantheon. And you can kind of see with this image along both the left and the right that it's been kind of dug out to the original level of the Roman streets. Now, this is also really important. When you first enter through the front of the Pantheon, it's like you're going into a regular rectangular Greek or Roman temple. And the Romans heralded the architecture and art of the Greeks, and so that's why their architecture looks very similar. However, with the Pantheon, once you enter into the main structure, you find that it's circular. Remember that the Romans invent the arch. An arch turned 360 degrees is a dome or a hemisphere, and this is basically an arch. So this is the largest uninterrupted space in the ancient world, 140 feet in diameter, and it is only going to be topped by the Florence Cathedral, and that's not going to be completed until the 1420s. The opening at the very top of this dome is called an oculus, which is Latin for eye. It is the light source for the building. There are no windows, even though it looks like there's some fake windows around the circumference of the structure. The walls here had to be 20 feet thick in order to support the dome. And yes, when it rains, it does rain inside the Pantheon. And so as we move through these wonderful pictures here, the video that you'll watch will walk you through the different elements that you see. One of the cool things about this structure, again, you can kind of tell it's Roman by these fake windows on the upper level. They have that triangular section over them. Those are called pediments. And then the roof itself is coffered, so you kind of see the square within a square within a square. That takes off a lot of the weight from the structure. It is made with concrete. However, after the fall of the Roman Empire, around 500 AD, the recipe for concrete is lost. This is also the resting place for the Renaissance artist Raphael. Now, we can do a whole bunch of different things with arches. We, of course, can turn them 360 degrees to make the dome or hemisphere. But if we put them one behind the other, we can create what's called a barrel vault. When two barrel vaults intersect, we create a groin vault. And you'll see those as labeled A and B in the upper portion of this slide. And this is how these great Gothic cathedrals were made. So this is a barrel vault here, and this is what's also called the nave. You normally enter a church like this at the very bottom of the cross, and that's where the congregation sits. You have another, what's called the crossing, which is another barrel vault further up. And this is where you have the small private family chapels for the very wealthy. So this is the Brancacci Chapel that we had talked about during our lecture on the Italian Renaissance. This is the best remaining works of Masaccio, and particularly the tribute money. As we move out of the Roman Empire and into the Middle Ages or Dark Ages, the arch itself begins to transform and become more of a pointed arch. And what this does, it allows for taller buildings. In the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, this is one of the first times we have what's going to be called a Gothic cathedral. And it's Gothic in terms of the walls opening up and for us to put stained glass in. And it's absolutely a stunning church, but you can kind of see, especially around the altar at the very front, those lower arches are absolutely pointed instead of curved. So that's our normal curved arch, and this would be called a Romanesque church. Compared to this is a Gothic church. And of course, we also have the incorporation of this wonderful stained glass. This is also going to be a resting place for many of the French monarchs. Unfortunately, those bodies were taken and destroyed during the French Revolution. Now, the problem with the pointed arch is that the weight of the building is taken down much more quickly, much more abruptly to the ground. And unfortunately, this caused a lot of these early churches to literally fall down because this pressure is coming straight down to the ground and it's forcing too much pressure on the walls. So the walls were basically blowing out. And so in order to fix this, architects developed what are called flying buttresses, which you see in the bottom image. And they are defined as extensions of interior arches. This is something that, again, happens during the Gothic age, and a lot of people think that it is aesthetic, which absolutely it is, but it is also very functional so that these buildings don't collapse. So this is a flying buttress, again, just an extension of the interior arch, and it helps supports the building. These are pretty solid, however, you can get some of these that are completely lace looking and much more ornamental. This is one of the most grand churches. This is the Hagia Sophia. And it's an incredible structure. It's been a church, a mosque. Today it's a tourist attraction. You can even get married there. And one of the most wonderful things about this church is the dome. The dome is absolutely gigantic. It's created around 532. And the term Hagia Sophia translates into holy wisdom. This is one of the last major building projects of the Roman Empire. And Emperor Justinian decided to build a church on the remains of one that had been destroyed. There were a whole bunch of people out of work. This was a major building project that everyone worked on, and it is the first time that we are putting a round dome on a square building. And so we have to do that through the use of pendentives. And you'll see the pendentives at each corner. There's some ornamentation along each. A pendentive is defined as a curving wall section set between arches, and you can see how they kind of lean inward, and they support a dome. What's wonderful about this is, this dates to 532 AD. This is the way we are still creating domes on square buildings today, is through the use of pendentives. And there's a close-up of one there. So this is Caesar's Palace here, and you can see the use of pendentives as well in the creation of this structure. What's also wonderful about the Hagia Sophia is that we're uncovering a lot of mosaics today. And we just talked about mosaics in the previous lecture on craft versus fine art. But during the 7th century, iconoclasts were going around and destroying mosaics, destroying graven images. And in order to preserve them, churches were plastering them over. However, through generations, the remembrance of where these mosaics were and that they existed at all disappeared. So today, with our wonderful types of radar and such, we're able to identify where these mosaics are, and there's a whole bunch of restoration effort put toward those. So you can find some videos on YouTube as well about the restoration of this church and its mosaics. Another thing that you'll see during the Middle Ages are tympanums. And tympanums are the semicircular areas over the outer doorways of churches. And again, this is during the Middle Ages, right around 1000 AD. and most of the people at this time were illiterate. So we could only understand stories from the Bible through images, or if it was read to us by learned people such as priests or monks. So here we're standing outside the door of this church, and we can look up and we can see the last judgment. And each of these tympanums here on this screen just show us a different story from the Bible, and this story is told through iconography. So this is the one we were looking at over the door. We have Christ in the center, surrounded by a full-body halo called a mandorla. We have those rising from their graves below, and you can kind of see the name of the artist here, which is very unique because during the Middle Ages, we don't normally have names that we can associate of the artists themselves. We're not going to see that until the Renaissance. So Gizilbertus is the artist's name. And this is one of my favorite scenes where the dead is kind of lined up to be judged, and you've got these claw-like hands coming down and plucking this person out of the lineup and just freaking out the person off to the left. We also have the weighing of souls to the right. And this is going to be my last image in our presentation on ancient architecture. Our next one will be on modern architecture.